Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we are immersing ourselves in the life and, really, the revolutionary work of Adeline Virginia Woolf. When you think of her, you probably picture that iconic portrait, the high forehead, that kind of intellectual intensity.
Yeah, everyone knows that image.
But that public image, it conceals one of the most internally complex lives of the 20th century.
It really does. And she's an essential subject for any deep dive, Woolf is. She's so much more than just a pillar of modernism. She's really a case study in tension.
Tension in what way?
Well, our sources show a woman who is navigating this extraordinarily affluent, intellectually privileged background, but at the same time, she's constantly struggling against these profound shadows of early trauma and, of course, a lifelong crippling battle with her mental health.
And that's what we're setting out to do today, isn't it? To understand how that tension, that constant crucible of her inner life, was somehow transformed into literary revolution. She is credited, of course, with pioneering the technique of stream of consciousness narration. I mean, essentially capturing thought itself on the page.
Right.
So our mission is to see how she managed to produce literature that fundamentally changed fiction, even while being constantly endangered by the fragility of her own mind.
Precisely. Virginia Woolf was born Adeline Virginia Stephen in 1882 in South Kensington, London. She was the seventh child in a pretty large blended family, and the legacy she inherited was one of immense intellectual distinction.
And that really set the stage for her future.
It absolutely did.
That legacy started with her parents. Her father, Sir Leslie Stephen, was a figure of true Victorian eminence, wasn't he?
Oh, completely. A renowned literary critic, historian, essayist, and the first editor of the Dictionary of National Biography, a giant of his time.
And her mother, Julia Princep Jackson, was equally formidable, a famed beauty, a model for pre-Raphaelite painters, and a dedicated philanthropist.
Yes, and the household itself was monumental and often chaotic. It was a blend. Julia had 3 children from her first marriage, George and Gerald Duckworth.
Right.
Leslie had one surviving daughter, Laura, from his first marriage, who spent much of her life institutionalized because of her own mental health struggles. And then came the 4 Stephen children, Vanessa, Thoby, Virginia, and Adrian. So you have 8 children, 3 distinct family lines. It was an intellectual hothouse, but one that was still rigidly structured by the expectations of the Victorian age.
Okay, let's unpack this environment, because it led to a very, very unusual start for her, especially when it comes to her education. We often assume literary giants have this great formal training, but Virginia, she didn't follow that path at all.
No, not even close. Her education was unique and, fiercely independent. Her mother, Julia Stephen, she subscribed to the prevailing belief that formal university-level education was unnecessary, maybe even detrimental for her daughters.
So Virginia was educated almost entirely at home. That sounds incredibly restrictive. Yet our sources emphasize that this restriction actually became a profound advantage. It gave her a deeper intellectual foundation than many of her university-educated male contemporaries. How did that happen?
It was entirely because of her father, Leslie Stephen.
Okay.
He provided her with unrestricted access to his vast, sprawling, and critically quite unexpurgated library.
Unexpurgated, that's the key word.
That's the key. She was allowed to roam through thousands of volumes without censorship, without guidance, reading philosophy, poetry, and history that most women of her era, even those attending the new women's colleges, would never have encountered.
So the foundation of her genius wasn't built by a syllabus or in a lecture hall.
No.
It was self-guided immersion in the full, unvarnished Western canon. That must have cultivated an extraordinary degree of intellectual curiosity and, I guess, critical perspective.
It developed her powers of synthesis tremendously. She herself would later say that this unrestricted reading gave her a far greater depth of literary exposure than her brother Thoby's Cambridge friends. She learned instinctively how to criticize and how to absorb influence.
But she didn't entirely forego structure, did she? She did receive some formal lessons.
She did, mainly private tutoring. She focused intensely on classical Greek and Latin, learning from tutors like Clara Pater and, crucially, Janet Case.
And Case was a big influence.
A huge influence. Case became a mentor and a lasting friend, and it was through her that Virginia was introduced to the burgeoning suffrage movement.
Ah, okay.
So this early exposure to feminism and political organization was a hugely formative influence on her thinking. She also attended some lectures on history and literature at the King's College Ladies Department, but she never pursued a degree.
It seems clear that writing wasn't something she learned to do. It was something she just did from an incredibly early age.
Oh, absolutely. By age 5, she was composing these elaborate letters. By age 10, she had created the Hyde Park Gate News.
The family newspaper.
An illustrated family newspaper, yeah. It chronicled all the little details of family life, and it was modeled on a popular, fast-paced magazine of the time called Titbits.
Was the Hyde Park Gate News just a childhood game? Or do biographers see that early structure and satirical lens as a direct training ground for her literary work?
It was absolutely a training ground. This early journalism gave her practice in narrative structure, observational detail, and, most importantly, satire.
Satire. At that age.
Oh, yes. She used the paper to subtly comment on the ridiculousness of social rituals, like her mother's attempts at matchmaking. Running that paper until 1895 instilled a routine of daily observation and writing that was just critical to her development.
I find the contrast between the sort of rigid intellectualism of their London home and the pure, almost transcendent joy of their annual family holidays so striking.
The summers at Talon House in St. Ives, Cornwall, they provided the raw material for her most evocative writing. For the first 13 years of her life, the family rented this large, isolated white house overlooking Portminster Bay and the Godrevy Lighthouse for 3 months every year.
And that location wasn't just a setting for her. It became a kind of mythic landscape, didn't it?
It was mythic. Those summers, just filled with the sensory details of the sea, the smell of salt, the vastness of the water, that rhythmic flash of the lighthouse, they heavily influenced the settings, the structures, and the recurring motifs in novels like The Waves and, of course, most famously, To the Lighthouse.
It was the geography of her happiest memories.
Her most innocent memories, before the shadow of trauma began to fall.
The transition from that idyllic setting to the trauma that followed, it demands a closer look. Because our sources highlight that this childhood, despite all the outward privilege, was profoundly fractured.
This is a difficult but essential truth of her biography. We know from her later autobiographical essay, A Sketch of the Past, written in 1939, that Woolf disclosed experiencing sexual abuse by her half-brother, Gerald Duckworth, during her childhood.
And that trauma didn't end there. There are suggestions of persistent emotional and physical impropriety from her other half-brother, George Duckworth.
Yes.
Especially after their mother's death when he took on the role of head of the household.
Biographers have documented this extensively. The suggestion is that George's role was far from benign. One noted that when Virginia's half-sister Stella died, there was no emotional counterbalance left to control George's predation and his nighttime prowling.
That's chilling.
And Woolf's own essay, 22 Hyde Park Gate, ends with this devastating, unforgettable line. George Duckworth was not only father and mother, brother and sister to those poor Stephen girls, he was their lover also.
It's speculated that this early, profound violation contributed significantly to the severe psychological distress and mental health issues that would plague her for her entire life. And this trauma was then compounded by a devastating chain of grief.
The chain of grief began in 1895 with the sudden death of her mother, Julia, from influenza. Virginia was only 13, and she called it the greatest disaster that could happen.
And that loss led to her first severe breakdown.
Yes, her first. It was characterized by agitation, nervousness, and inability to concentrate, and it lasted for many months. She virtually stopped writing for 2 years.
Then, just 2 years later, tragedy struck again, doubling that burden.
Stella Duckworth, who had valiantly tried to step into that parental role and provide some stability, died in July 1897, shortly after her marriage.
And this second major loss brought on Virginia's first recorded expressed wish for death. She was just 15 years old.
You can see her channeling that scenario's sudden, overwhelming, repetitive loss directly into the structure and emotional landscape of To the Lighthouse, especially in that stark, desolate time passes section.
The final blow came 7 years later in 1904.
The death of her father, Leslie Stephen, in February 1904 precipitated her most alarming and acute psychological crisis yet.
How severe was it?
It lasted from April to September and was characterized by profound depression, delusion, and hallucination. This episode resulted in her being briefly institutionalized and, critically, included at least one suicide attempt where she threw herself out of a window.
God.
She later looked back on the period between 1897 and 1904 and just called it the 7 unhappy years.
It's remarkable that during this period of intense personal crisis, George Duckworth, maybe seeking to impose some sort of Victorian normalcy, tried to force Virginia and Vanessa into polite society.
That's right. George was determined to manage the girl's entry into society, which for him meant proper marriage proposals, suitable drawing rooms, acceptance by the right circle.
But Virginia resisted.
Fiercely. She was already prioritizing her internal life and her writing above any kind of social compliance.
She characterized that world as a machine, didn't she?
She did. She reflected on it bitterly. Society in those days was a very competent, perfectly complacent, ruthless machine. A girl had no chance against its fangs. No other desires, say, to paint or to write, could be taken seriously.
So her determination to write and to reject that machine set the stage for the next most crucial phase of her life.
Yeah, absolutely.
That pushback against George Duckworth's rigid social world required its own intellectual space. And that space took the physical form of their move to Bloomsbury, which really defined her mature identity.
That move, following her father's death in 1904, was a fundamental turning point. Virginia, Vanessa, Adrian, and Thoby moved out of the stuffy Victorian confines of South Kensington to the more bohemian, less restrictive, and more affordable Bloomsbury district. They settled at 46 Gordon Square.
And importantly, the Duckworth half-brothers did not join them.
That's key. They did not.
So this was a geographical and a psychological liberation. They were finally free to create their own intellectual climate.
Absolutely. The sisters especially just thrived. Starting in March 1905, they hosted these open social gatherings they called Thursday evenings.
And the goal was to recreate the atmosphere of Cambridge.
Exactly. To recreate the intellectual stimulation of their brother Thoby's Trinity College, Cambridge environment, but critically, without the rules.
And that rapidly evolved into the core of the legendary Bloomsbury Group. Who were the key players that shaped Virginia's thought during this period?
It was fundamentally Thoby's circle of brilliant, progressive Cambridge friends. Leonard Woolf, Lytton Strachey, Clive Bell, and Saxon Sidney Turner. They gathered for these evenings discussing literature, philosophy, and art with an openness that directly challenged Victorian morality.
The group gained notoriety very quickly for its progressive views, particularly on sexuality, but also for its anti-establishment antics. Let's talk about the Dreadnought hoax.
The Dreadnought hoax in 1910 was a quintessential Bloomsbury statement. Virginia participated by dressing as a male member of an Abyssinian entourage, Prince Mendax.
Complete with blackface and fake beards.
Yes, to fool the British Royal Navy. They pretended to be high-ranking guests from Abyssinia, requesting a tour of the HMS Dreadnought, the flagship of the Navy.
It sounds utterly audacious and very high risk.
It was audacious, and it succeeded, much to the embarrassment of the Admiralty. It symbolized their collective rejection of the pomposity, the rigid hierarchy, and the military might of the Edwardian establishment. It was a clear, public, anti-authoritarian stance.
And they carried that into their artistic and political lives.
They did.
While the group was known for its intellectual debate, the artistic influence of her sister, Vanessa Bell, seems particularly potent in Virginia's literary development.
Very much so. Vanessa and her husband, Clive Bell, whom she married just 2 days after Thoby's tragic death in 1906, they were immersed in avant-garde art, particularly post-impressionism.
A movement that rejected strict realism.
Exactly. It rejected the realism of the previous century, focusing instead on subjective color, light, and form.
So how does a painter's interest in subjective color translate into a novelist's style?
It pushed Virginia toward non-traditional forms. Just as post-impressionists valued subjective experience over objective reality, Virginia began experimenting with narrative structures that prioritized internal perception over external plot.
So she started asking, what if the real action of a novel takes place entirely inside a character's mind?
Exactly. Refracted through subjective consciousness rather than through external events. This link between Vanessa's art and Virginia's literary modernism is critical.
This period also brought Leonard Woolf back into her life. He returned from his colonial civil service post in Ceylon in 1911 and moved in as a tenant, and he proposed soon after.
Leonard proposed in January 1912. Virginia's response was complex and conflicted. She explicitly stated her initial reluctance, admitting that she felt no physical attraction for him.
That's a frank, even brutal assessment.
It is. It reflects her preference for female companionship and her general distrust of the possessive nature she associated with Victorian men.
But she eventually accepted, marrying him in August 1912. What was it that ultimately drew her to him?
She later declared her deep affection and need for him. The relationship was built on a profoundly intellectual, supportive, and mutual bond rather than passionate physical romance. She recognized that Leonard offered the stability, the protection, and the intellectual equality she craved. She wrote, "I feel you have taken away the chill. I feel more ready to face the world.
This marriage, however, came with a crucial, life-altering decision that fundamentally shaped their domestic world.
Yes. Leonard made the conscious, difficult decision that they would not have children.
Why was that?
He firmly believed that Virginia's mental health was just too fragile to withstand the immense psychological and physical strain of motherhood. He feared it would trigger a permanent, debilitating breakdown.
That must have been a painful decision, but it highlights Leonard's role as her absolute protector and guardian, prioritizing her stability above all else.
It was an act of profound dedication. He essentially devoted his life to managing her illness, creating an environment where she could work without undue stress.
And it was that constant need to shield her from stress, specifically the stress of external publishers, that led to their most revolutionary venture, the Hogarth Press.
It did.
The establishment of the press in 1917 serves as a perfect demonstration of therapeutic relief transforming into artistic autonomy.
That's the genius of it. Leonard initially established the press specifically to relieve the anxiety Virginia experienced when submitting her manuscripts to outside companies.
Like her half-brother's publishing house.
Exactly. Duckworth had published her first novel, The Voyage Out, but the publication process had contributed directly to one of her earlier, severe breakdowns because of the external pressure and scrutiny.
So the Hogarth Press was literally a mechanism to control her anxiety and protect her creativity. How did they begin?
The logistics were incredibly humble. It really emphasizes the DIY artisanal nature of the Bloomsbury ethos. They started on their dining room table at Hogarth House in Richmond using a small hand-printing press.
And Virginia found the physical process calming.
Yes, she described the process of setting type and printing as physically calming and mentally engaging, which was vital for her fragile state.
What was their initial output?
The very first publication, produced entirely by hand, was 2 stories in 1917. It contained Virginia's early experimental modernist work, The Mark on the Wall, and Leonard's story, 3 Jews.
What's fascinating here is how quickly they moved beyond simply publishing their own work and became champions of the entire avant-garde literary scene.
Their focus was unique. Unlike many small artisanal printers of the time, the Hogarth Press made a point of championing living, revolutionary authors, often those who were just too experimental for mainstream publishing houses.
Like T.S. Eliot.
They published T.S. Eliot's The Waste Land in its first English edition. They also published work by Catherine Mansfield and E.M. Forster.
And they also demonstrated a serious commitment to radical political and philosophical thought.
Absolutely. Their scope extended far beyond fiction. They were the first to publish the complete English translation of Sigmund Freud's psychoanalytic works,
which had a massive impact on English intellectual life.
a huge impact, and arguably on Woolf's own attempts to understand the interior mind.
And politically, they were uncompromising.
The press was fiercely political, reflecting both Virginia's feminism and Leonard's anti-colonial and anti-fascist stance. They published pamphlets that directly challenged colonialism and critiqued Italian fascism and Soviet Russia.
And Virginia herself used the press to link feminism and international politics.
She did. Her work, 3 Guineas, for example, explicitly resisted what she termed the patriarchal fascism of war and nationalism. They published memoirs of suffragettes, biographies of Indian feminist activists. The press became a crucial nexus of progressive thought.
As their careers flourished, they increasingly divided their time between the intellectual stimulation of London and the necessary calm of the country.
Yes, they found refuge in Sussex. Initially, they rented a place called Asham House, which was remote, a bit dilapidated, famously lacked water and electricity. But following the heavy bombing of London during WWII, which actually destroyed their 2 London homes, they settled permanently at Monk's House in Rodmill.
And Monk's House became her final anchor.
It did. They purchased the property for a mere £700. Leonard Woolf fondly described the view across the River Ouse towards the South Downs as being historically unchanged since the days of Chaucer. This house and its garden became their final protected space and Virginia's permanent home until her death.
Moving now into Section 3, let's look at the incredible output that cemented her reputation as the lyrical innovator. If we had to define the voice of modernism in her writing, what are its hallmarks?
Well, the hallmark is its radical experimentation with time and consciousness. Her work is intensely lyrical, often dissolving the traditional narrative structure.
So instead of following a linear plot,
The story is, as one critic put it, refracted and sometimes almost dissolved in the character's receptive consciousness.
So she's prioritizing the internal flow of sensation, memory, and thought over external action. It's the fusion of intensive lyricism, almost poetry, with stylistic virtuosity.
That's exactly right. You are reading the internal landscape of the mind. Her work is rich in auditory and visual impressions, creating a sensory world that allows the reader to experience time as fluid and subjective, rather than rigidly linear. The sheer poetic quality of her prose distinguishes her from other modernists like Joyce, who often focus more on intellectual density.
That stylistic approach helped her rise to prominence dramatically during the interwar period. What are the canonical novels that best exemplify this technique?
Her major canonical novels include Mrs. Dalloway from 1925, which shifts between the consciousness of Clarissa Dalloway and Septimus Smith in a single day.
To the Lighthouse in 1927.
Yes, which uses the Godrevy lighthouse as a symbolic anchor for subjective memory and the passage of time. And then The Waves in 1931, which is perhaps her most radical experiment. It's often described as a novel written entirely in prose poetry, consisting of soliloquies by 6 distinct characters.
But her influence extended far beyond fiction. Her nonfiction work remains perhaps the most quoted and discussed today.
Without a doubt, A Room of One's Own and 3 Guineas are still foundational texts, essential reading in feminist theory, political science, and literary criticism globally.
We should probably note that her dramatic output was minimal.
Oh, very minimal. She wrote only one drama, Freshwater, which was a short 3-act comedy satirizing the ridiculousness of the Victorian age, based on her great-aunt, the famous photographer Julia Margaret Cameron.
Let's focus on A Room of One's Own. This essay originated from 2 lectures she gave at Cambridge. Beyond the famous dictum, what was the deep historical and economic core of her argument?
Well, the book-length essay uses this quasi-fictional style, employing the voice of an omniscient narrator, Mary Benton, to investigate the barriers to female creativity. And the core of the argument is that literary genius requires specific material conditions.
A woman must have money and a room of her own if she is to write fiction.
Exactly.
She wasn't just talking about a physical room, was she? She was talking about space, time, financial independence, intellectual freedom.
Precisely. She examines the historical disempowerment of women socially, financially, and educationally over centuries. She calculated that if legendary male authors required £500 a year and a locked room to produce masterpieces, then women, historically barred from inheritance, education, and professions, were deprived of the most basic necessities for creation.
And she used that brilliant comparison of Shakespeare's sister to drive the point home about systemic oppression.
It's one of the most powerful thought experiments in feminist literature. She invents Judith Shakespeare, a woman with the same staggering genius as her brother William.
But Judith is denied everything.
Denied schooling, freedom, experience, the financial means, and she's ultimately driven to suicide. Woolf contrasts this suppressed and mute and inglorious genius with female writers who did succeed despite the odds, like Jane Austen.
But who, out of necessity,
wrote entirely as a woman, confining their enormous talent to domestic social observation because that was the only world they were allowed to know.
If we move from her powerful nonfiction back to her fiction, what recurring themes and motifs permeate her work beyond the stream of consciousness technique?
The sea is arguably the most deeply embedded motif.
Structurally, linguistically, thematically.
Everything. It stems directly from those formative childhood summers in Cornwall. The sea and seascapes saturate her novels and diaries, serving as metaphors for time, memory, the subconscious, and the passage of life.
I remember reading one specific critical insight about the relationship between her style and this motif.
Yes, the critic Elizabeth Abel pointed out a wonderful detail. Woolf's frequent use of the semicolon has been interpreted by some as resembling the shape and function of the wave. A pause, a surge, but never a full stop.
That's fascinating.
It reinforces the cyclical, fluid nature of time and memory that she was trying to capture, constantly returning to its source, the sea.
If we shift focus now to social commentary, she lived directly after the unprecedented trauma of the First World War. How did that enormous event manifest in her work?
War and its profound psychological fallout were central to Mrs. Dalloway. By dividing the novel's consciousness between Clarissa Dalloway, who's dealing with social anxiety and aging, and Septimus Warren Smith, a shell-shocked WWI veteran Woolf provided an incredibly authentic voice for those veterans suffering from what we now recognize as PTSD.
She connected the public trauma of the trenches to the private agony of the individual.
Exactly. Septimus is haunted by the dead and suffering from state-sanctioned violence, and his tragedy becomes an indictment of a society that understands neither his pain nor the violence it perpetuated. The structural choice to contrast his experience with Clarissa's social observations of the same day creates a powerful moral tension.
And what about class? She existed in this highly privileged intellectual circle. Did she merely observe the system, or did she actively critique the class structure she was undeniably part of?
She continuously evaluated the lens of her own privileged elite background. She was highly self-aware of her position. In her 1936 essay, Am I a Snob?, she admitted that she was in fact a snob, conditioned by her environment and education.
But she used her work to attack that structure.
She did. Both fiction and nonfiction launched fierce attacks on the rigid, often cruel class structure of Britain, particularly how that structure restricted opportunities for the working class. Critics often wrestle with this paradox. She was both an elite member of society and a fierce, sometimes contradictory, social critic.
Connecting her work to global influences, our research highlights a heavy debt owed to Russian literature.
She deeply admired the Russian masters and adopted many of their aesthetic conventions. She particularly praised Anton Chekhov for his quiet, subtle, psychological short stories of ordinary, banal lives and plots that lacked neat, satisfying conclusions.
That anti-plot approach would have appealed to her.
It aligned perfectly with her own shift away from Victorian narrative expectations.
And what did she take from Leo Tolstoy?
From Tolstoy, she learned how to effectively depict a character's internal tension and psychological state, particularly in moments of moral crisis or intense emotional realization. She called Tolstoy's work a masterpiece of complexity.
Yet she had reservations about Fyodor Dostoevsky, perhaps the most psychologically intense of the Russian writers.
Yes. While acknowledging his revolutionary influence on depicting a fluid mind in operation, she objected to Dostoevsky's unrelenting focus on psychological extremity and the tumultuous flux of emotions. She found him exhausting and, frankly, overwhelming.
She preferred something calmer.
She preferred the balance, the philosophical calm, and the simplicity found in other Russian masters.
We also see a surprising influence from American transcendentalism, which is not an obvious pairing for a British modernist.
That's right. She praised Henry David Thoreau, the 19th century American philosopher and author of Walden, for his profound simplicity. In a 1917 essay, she highlighted his belief that solitude and silence are essential for intellectual clarity.
And she even quotes him directly.
She quotes his famous statement, "To be awake is to be alive." She embraced the transcendentalist idea that stillness allows the mind to contemplate, finding deep emotions generated even by banal, ordinary things. She sought to capture this moment of realization, this state of being intensely awake, which is a structural goal in many of her most lyrical passages.
This focus on the mind's interior life, the search for truth through psychological depth, brings us directly to the great defining factor of her biography. Section 4, The Inner Storm.
Her mental health struggles were a constant defining reality. She suffered periodic mood swings, what we now suspect was bipolar disorder, starting around age 13 after her mother's death. This was not a temporary phase, it was a lifelong battle.
And it's also been suggested she may have been autistic.
Yes, the writer and social anthropologist Camille Capriolio has suggested that, based on Woolf's writings and observations, she may have been autistic, which could have been a contributing factor to her unique mental health profile.
Leonard Woolf was intimately involved in managing this condition for 30 years, and he noted that the doctors they consulted generally diagnosed her with neurasthenia.
Neurasthenia was a catch-all Victorian diagnosis for nervous exhaustion. And crucially, Leonard noted that the medical establishment of the time had little real understanding of the causes or the true nature of her severe symptoms. The prescribed solution was relentlessly simplistic: a quiet life free of any significant mental or physical exertion.
Which, for a mind like hers, was counterproductive and even harmful.
Absolutely. Any intellectual strain or the pressure of external events would cause symptoms to return, beginning with severe headaches, an inability to concentrate, and racing thoughts that could spiral into delusion and hallucinations. The common medical remedy was simple: total rest, in bed, in a darkened room, until the symptoms slowly subsided. This was often devastating to her creative process.
We have several specific accounts of her institutionalization, particularly the horrific rest cure, which she utterly resisted and despised.
In the early 1910s, she endured 3 short periods at Burleigh House. a private nursing home for women with nervous disorder. This was the famous rest cure, which involved forced isolation, enforced silence, and even force feeding.
And most torturous for Virginia, the deprivation of all literature.
A mind like hers, deprived of reading and writing, it must have pushed her to the edge.
It was a kind of intellectual death sentence for her.
It was. She described the institution as ugly. The religious atmosphere is stifling. She went so far as to tell her sister, Vanessa, that to escape she might have to jump out of a window. The specter and threat of being sent back to Burleigh House would later become a recurring, deeply terrifying memory that haunted her when her symptoms returned.
And that desperation, that fear of institutional control, culminated in her first major suicide attempt in 1913.
It did. After emerging from Burleigh and being advised by 2 physicians that she needed to return, she made a clear, deliberate attempt on her life on September 9th, 1913.
An overdose.
She overdosed on 100 grains of veronal, a powerful barbiturate, and nearly died, only surviving thanks to the frantic efforts of Surgeon Geoffrey Keynes and others.
She went on to live another 28 years, producing her greatest work, but the instability, as we know, remained. What was the profound relationship between her illness and her art? Did she see writing as a cure, or did she use it to process the condition itself?
She saw it fundamentally as a mechanism to keep afloat. She had this core belief that writing was essential to her survival. She once wrote, "Directly I stop working, I feel that I am sinking down, down. And as usual, I feel that if I sink further, I shall reach the truth."
Sinking down, down. That's a stunning, tragic duality. The metaphor for depression also being the metaphor for finding artistic truth.
It became her central psychological and artistic motif. Sinking underwater represented both the terrifying, chaotic effects of depression and psychosis, but simultaneously it was the process of diving deep into the subconscious to discover profound, radical truth.
And tragically, this metaphor informed her final, literal choice of death.
Choosing the water as the final destination for truth.
And this internal struggle, this journey through mental instability, became vital source material for her most famous works, granting her an empathy few writers could achieve.
Yes. The symptoms and struggles of her illness, including her hallucinations and the feeling of isolation, found a powerful, empathetic outlet in her art. Most famously, the character of Septimus Warren Smith in Mrs. Dalloway is a mirror of her own experience.
He's tormented by the trauma of war.
Tormented by war, haunted by the dead, and he ultimately chooses to take his own life by falling from a window rather than submit to the dehumanizing institutionalization offered by medical ignorance. Woolf's portrait of Septimus remains one of the most powerful literary representations of mental distress in the 20th century.
We now approach the end of her life, and our sources outline the converging factors that led to her final, fatal breakdown in 1940-41.
The pressures were overwhelming. Her depression worsened significantly due to the horrors of the Second World War. She was deeply anxious about the future of European civilization.
And this external dread was compounded by personal loss.
The destruction of her 2 London homes in the Blitz, and additionally she was deeply wounded by the cold, dismissive reception of her biography of her late friend, the art critic Roger Fry.
She had just completed her final manuscript, Between the Acts, and completing a novel often brought intense psychological exhaustion.
That exhaustion, coupled with the external pressures and the resurfacing of her acute mental symptoms, she began to hear the voices again, felt totally unable to concentrate or work. It led her to feel she could not continue. Her diary shows her growing obsession with death as her mood darkened. She was actively opposed to the war, criticizing Leonard for enlisting in the Home Guard, wearing what she called the silly uniform.
And the final act came on March 28, 1941.
She left Monk's house, walked down to the fast-flowing River Ouse nearby, and drowned herself, ensuring she sank quickly by placing a large stone in her pocket. Her body was tragically not found for 3 weeks.
Her suicide note to Leonard is devastating, serving as both a final expression of love and a raw document of her struggle.
It speaks volumes about the depth of their relationship and the unrelenting terror of her illness. She wrote that she felt certain that I am going mad again, and that she simply couldn't fight the terrible disease any longer.
But she expressed immense gratitude for his protection.
Immense. She stated, "You have given me the greatest possible happiness. You have been in every way all that anyone could be. If anybody could have saved me, it would have been you." The note concludes with the crushing declaration, "I can't go on spoiling your life any longer."
That emotional honesty leads us directly to Section 5. the contradictions and context of her views, which are essential for a full portrait of her complexity. Let's start with the revolutionary sexual openness of the Bloomsbury milieu.
The Bloomsbury Group was known for its rejection of Victorian morality. They held very progressive and non-monogamous views on sexuality, and the majority of the core members were openly bisexual or homosexual, embracing what they called a life of perfect liberty.
And Virginia certainly embraced that sexual freedom, most notably in her decade-long affair with Vida Sackville-West.
Vida Sackville-West was a crucial figure in her life. They were lovers for a decade, starting in the mid-1920s, and remained close friends until Woolf's death. This affair was a profound emotional and creative source for her.
And Vida was the direct inspiration for Orlando.
The direct inspiration for the titular protagonist of Orlando. A biography. It's a masterpiece of biographical fantasy, almost a love letter to Vida.
And Virginia considered Vida one of the most important people in her life.
She did. Vida herself wrote to her husband that Virginia had told her she only truly loved 3 people in her life: Leonard, Vanessa, and Vida herself. This speaks to the powerful, life-affirming nature of their connection.
What about her general stated preference regarding partners, especially given her conflicting feelings about her husband, Leonard?
Well, Vida Sackville-West noted in her diaries that Virginia often expressed a deep dislike for what she perceived as the possessiveness and love of domination in men, feelings that stemmed perhaps from her half-brothers. She was honest with Leonard about feeling no physical attraction. She stated that women stimulated her imagination more and preferred female lovers to male lovers.
Despite the non-physical nature of their intimacy, the stability that Leonard provided remained paramount.
Absolutely. It was a strong and supportive marriage, a profound partnership built on mutual respect, care, and intellectual collaboration. It provided the protective environment that allowed her genius to flourish. Without Leonard's structure and commitment, it's highly unlikely she would have written her most significant works.
If we connect her intellectual life to the bigger political picture, her public and published views were fiercely progressive for her time. She was a radical feminist and humanist.
She was a committed humanist, born into a family where both parents were prominent agnostic atheists. She was a strong philosophical critic of organized religion, describing Christianity to her friend Ethel Smith as a self-righteous egotism.
And politically.
Politically, she was an ardent feminist, a vocal anti-colonialist and anti-imperialist, and a fierce pacifist, fundamentally opposed to war and censorship.
Her book, 3 Guineas, is the clearest distillation of this political identity.
3 Guineas, from 1938, is a comprehensive indictment of fascism and patriarchal violence, which she saw as intrinsically linked. She argued that the tyranny of the private home, the domination of women by men, was the domestic equivalent of the tyranny of the state in Hitler's Germany or Mussolini's Italy.
So she believed that until women achieved equality,
they should refuse to participate in patriotic wars, since those wars were waged to protect a society that subjugated them.
So we have this revolutionary, empathetic, progressive thinker. But the research compels us to confront the profoundly controversial private views she held regarding race and class. This is the central, difficult contradiction of her legacy.
It is the paradox we must address impartially. Virginia Woolf is rightly celebrated as a revolutionary feminist and one of the most empathetic writers of the 20th century, particularly regarding trauma and the suppressed female experience.
Yeah.
Yet our sources make it clear that she simultaneously held views that are now considered deeply offensive, sometimes crossing the line into what we would label as hate speech.
What specific examples of class prejudice are cited in her private writings?
Her privileged Victorian upbringing was difficult to shed. Her diaries contain examples of severe classist remarks. There's a 1920 entry where she states, "The fact is, the lower classes are detestable." She also recorded shocking, prejudicial comments against disabled people, advocating for imbeciles to be killed. Her private writings reveal a streak of xenophobia and racism, referring to baboon-faced intellectuals and describing attendees at a peace conference as sad, green-dressed Negroes and Negresses looking like chimpanzees.
And perhaps the most complex controversy is the accusation of anti-Semitism, which is a paradox given her loving marriage to Leonard Woolf, an irreligious Jewish man.
This specific controversy is extremely challenging. While Leonard was a non-practicing Jew with little connection to the culture, Virginia often privately expressed a deep-seated hatred rooted in anti-Semitic stereotypes. She wrote to Ethel Smith, "How I hated marrying a Jew, how I hated their nasal voices and their oriental jewelry and their noses and their waddles, what a snob I was." She also recorded in her diary, "I do not like the Jewish voice, I do not like the Jewish laugh."
Did these private prejudices bleed into her published fiction?
They did. Her 1938 short story, The Duchess and the Jeweler, originally titled The Duchess and the Jew, characterized the Jewish protagonist using such negative, grotesque stereotypes that it sparked internal controversy.
So it was noticed at the time.
Oh, yes. Harper's Bazaar, which was set to publish the story, required her to modify the language before publication, a modification she reluctantly agreed to. This shows that her prejudices were impactful enough to draw contemporary criticism and even censorship. This profound complexity forces us to acknowledge her inherent ideological flaws alongside her genius.
As we transition to the final portion of our deep dive, let's look at her enduring influence. Despite the ebb and flow of critical favor, how was her reputation reestablished, and how does she continue to shape literature today?
Her reputation had declined significantly in the post-war period, but it was comprehensively reestablished by the growth of 1970s feminist criticism,
Which championed her work.
yes, particularly A Room of One's Own, as foundational. Today, her work remains central to global scholarship, translated into over 50 languages.
Her pioneering work on interior monologue clearly had a massive impact on subsequent generations of novelists who sought to explore the nonlinear nature of consciousness.
Absolutely. Celebrated authors across the globe have acknowledged her specific influence. Gabriel Garcia Marquez, for instance, stated that he learned the technique of the interior monologue directly from her, preferring her lyrical sensory usage to the denser style of James Joyce.
And Toni Morrison.
Yes, Toni Morrison noted that she studied Woolf intensively during the 1950s, highlighting how Woolf provided a crucial model for exploring the inner lives of female characters.
The cultural presence of Virginia Woolf today is undeniable, extending far beyond academic circles.
She is truly ubiquitous as a cultural figure. She remains the best-selling author in terms of postcards sold by London's National Portrait Gallery, outselling any other person depicted there.
That's an amazing fact.
Her image has become a symbol of intellectual feminism, appearing on countless items. And in 2019, Time magazine selected her as their Woman of the Year for 1929 in a retrospective celebration of influential women of the century.
She is also well memorialized in the UK, often at locations tied directly to her life and work.
Tributes are numerous. These include the Virginia Woolf Building at King's College London, her alma mater for lectures, and a prominent bust in Tavistock Square where she lived with Leonard. Most recently, in 2022, the first full-size statue of Woolf was unveiled in Richmond upon Thames,
Depicting her on a bench.
seated on a bench overlooking the River Thames, bringing her permanent presence back to one of the neighborhoods where she found her initial artistic freedom.
And even now, 80 years after her death, new aspects of her creative output are still being discovered.
That's the most exciting piece of recent news. Just in January 2025, 2 previously unknown poems by Woolf were discovered at the Harry Ransom Center in Austin, Texas. These poems, dated sometime after March 1927, are said to reveal a different shade to the author, suggesting that her life and work continue to be a subject of new insights and discoveries. Her complexity is still unfolding.
What stands out to me most powerfully is that duality we discussed throughout this deep dive. This is an author who used the agonizing experience of sinking underwater, her mental illness, as a metaphor for finding profound, empathetic truth, particularly about the suppressed female experience.
And yet we must equally acknowledge that the same singular mind that produced such revolutionary empathetic literature, capable of expressing the deepest nuances of human suffering and class inequality, also held and privately expressed deeply offensive, classist, racist, and anti-Semitic views molded by the prejudices of her privileged Victorian background.
So we leave you with this final provocative thought. What does this unavoidable paradox teach us about the complex, often contradictory relationship between genius and ideology? Can we truly separate the transformative artist from the flawed person? And what implications does that separation or lack thereof hold for how we consume and celebrate culture today? Something to mull over until the next deep dive.